Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to a Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, Theorizing the Present conversation about the 2024 U.S. election. I'm Joe Masco. I'm a 3CT fellow and also a professor in the anthropology department. And I have a few things to get us started, and then we'll hear from our two speakers today. I think the need to theorize contemporary U.S. politics, to understand its affects, its imaginaries, its misrecognitions, and its ambitions has never been more urgent. The breakdown in a common information sphere, combined with the volatility of disruptive technologies, environmental breakdowns, the legacies of war, and of financial uncertainty, none of which are new, has nonetheless produced an unprecedentedly polarized and deeply unhappy electorate. So we're here today to consider how it is that such basic structures in American life have become so contested. The separation between church and state, the vital role of immigration in U.S. history, the need to understand and acknowledge American racial histories, the integrity of not only the vote, but the entire apparatus of representative democracy are all now violently in question. How is it that so many Americans today do not trust the political process, are xenophobic and violently opposed to immigrants, that want all discussions of race and gender stripped from schools, that reject public health and vaccines in the midst of a global pandemic, that disavow environmental sciences during an amplifying climate emergency, or that want to roll back basic human, civil, and reproductive rights explicitly in favor of a consolidated whiteness and patriarchy. So we're here today to consider the imbrications of social media and white racial grievance in contemporary American politics, asking how the specific information strategies available to everyone online have been deployed in such a way to amplify white rage, a kind of toxic masculinity, and calls for a violent rejection of democratic norms and practices. So we are extremely lucky today to have two exemplary scholars and public intellectuals on just these themes. Both have written widely as academics on contemporary political conditions and have also worked as dedicated public intellectuals across television, radio, magazines, social media, op-eds, and via testimonies to Congress. So these are two of my favorite people and thinkers. Please help me in welcoming Joan Donovan and Kathleen Belew.
Thank you. So there's some more chairs scattered out here. I'll just give a few seconds for people to come in and have a seat, including one of my former students.
I have a little more to say, and then I'll turn it over to everybody. So please grab a seat.
Yes, please come on in.
So I just wanted to give you a few words about our speakers and the expertise that they bring to this conversation. At the end of the table, of course, is Joan Donovan, who is an expert on media manipulation, online extremism, and disinformation practices. She's currently an assistant professor of journalism and emerging media studies at Boston University, where she leads the Critical Internet Studies Institute. Before that, she's held prominent positions at Data and Society in their media manipulation initiative in New York, and was also the director of the Technology and Social Change Research Project at Harvard's Kennedy School. And Joan's just been a pioneering figure in building out an internet studies focused on social justice concerns. Joan's research focuses on how internet technologies are exploited to disseminate false information and to radicalize individuals. And to my mind, she's been very essential in developing new grammars, methods, and frameworks for analyzing media ecosystems, mapping the actors, the messages, and the platforms involved in disinformation networks. In her co-written book, Meme Wars, The Untold Story of the Online Battles Upending Democracy in America, Joan examines how fringe groups, particularly on platforms like 4chan, Reddit, and Facebook, weaponize memes and digital symbols to normalize extremist ideologies. Her research highlights how memes operate as a coded language for sharing ideological messages and drawing in new audiences, shedding light on how seemingly harmless online practices, particularly things like humor, are strategically used for recruitment and radicalization. So her pioneering work in this field has made a major contribution to understanding the psychological and social mechanisms of digital extremism, providing a foundation for developing potential counter strategies. For today, I think Joan's work is particularly powerful in showing how seemingly innocuous online behaviors can form a structured system for extremism and ideological recruitment. Memes, humor, anonymity online have all been quite consciously weaponized and are part of an expanding logic of what I think we can call information warfare or psyops, or attempts to delegitimize democratic voices and social justice practices. So I wanted to welcome Joan to the table. Next to me is Kathleen Belew, who's known to many of you as a former history professor on this campus, who's now up at Northwestern and is associate professor. Belew's groundbreaking book, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, traces the white power movement's origins to post-Vietnam disillusionment, documenting how veterans, militias, and white supremacists mobilized in opposition to perceived threats to white identity. Her analysis reveals how these groups strategically harnessed the trauma of war, framing their activities as a continuation of a battle to defend the nation, which has profound implications for modern-day extremist violence. Importantly, Kathleen has shown how that white power is a social movement, not an atomized, individualized set of actions as historically it has been treated in the courts. Instead, she shows it has a political and media strategy. It draws on both military and police training for a war against the federal government, and that ultimately it seeks to overthrow the federal government in defense of an imagined whiteness. Kathleen is also the co-editor with Ramon Gutierrez of A Field Guide to White Supremacy, and has a forthcoming book on the 1990s era of gun violence in Colorado, entitled Home at the End of the World, which I know I'm looking forward to. For today's conversation, I think Kathleen is going to be able to help us articulate the shifting nature of white nationalism over the decades, as well as the ways that calls for revolutionary violence are structured online and via militias and individuals embedded now within formal political campaigns. She's been extraordinarily active as a public intellectual on the Stop the Steal campaign, as well as the logics and implications of the January 6th riot. So welcome, Kathleen. So what I thought we would do for the structuring of the event is we'll hear from both our speakers and then give them a little bit of a chance to maybe engage each other, and then we'll open it up for questions. So as we're going, please collect your thoughts and be ready. We'll have a good period of time for collective conversation after we hear from both Joan and Kathleen. So with that, Joan, would you like to take over?
Sure. It's really awesome to be at University of Chicago. I love it here. I was a Pritzker Fellow, and Anna and Ryan have been taking care of me now over the last couple of times that I've been here, and so many thanks to y'all.
Indeed.
As well, sitting here next to Kathleen, who's one of my sort of academic heroes, has got me a little nervous. She's like, she's just sort of the OG here in this field. So I'm excited to hear what she has to say, or maybe terrified to say what I have to say in front of her. But nevertheless, I'm going to be presenting today about the current state of meme wars and how they're leading to this process I call networked incitement. It's different from traditional incitement where time, place, and manner really matters, right? So if I say, hey, y'all, let's go do crimes, and we all go out and do some kind of crime, it would fit the model of incitement. But online, practices of networked incitement are often slower, and they happen over time. And usually it's someone in a very densely networked position that doesn't necessarily even call for violence, but due to the ingrained, embodied practices of what it means to be a troll or to do brigading online, people just kind of know what to do once certain provocateurs name and shame either doctors that are performing gender-affirming care or schools that are integrating LGBTQ concepts or concepts about race and racism. And we see this time and time again. So I'm going to go through and show you how that process plays out. And then I'm going to talk about what it means to be doing this in the static age. So when I study meme wars, what I'm really looking at is the use of slogans, images, and video on social media in persuasive political campaigns. I'm not coming at it from a cyber war type of framework. It's much more about the persuasiveness of whatever the content is matched with the delivery system, especially a delivery system like social media, which is meant to polarize. None of you are going to go, post your mediocre pizza, lunch today, right? We didn't have pizza. This food is excellent. But I'm saying that when you go to post something online, it's because you want to memorialize some experience. It's either better or you're complaining and it's worse. But people don't generally post in the middle. And so social media becomes a really important context in which people are receiving these very rapid messages that some have designed in order to be psychologically impactful. So what makes a great meme is that it is authorless, it promotes in-groups and out-groups. In the advertising parlance, it's sticky, and it's participatory. So a lot of great memes that are based on slogans reflect what we see in advertising. Like if I say, I'm loving it, or just do it, you know what companies I'm making reference to there. I don't have to state it as, and that's the way that memes work, is that, they're usually 3-word pithy phrases. This is why it drives me crazy watching Harris rallies, because they keep messing up the chant, "We're not going back." But if they just shortened it to "not going back," it would work flawlessly. Right? But it just sounds like garbled nonsense because they're not sort of thinking about the ways in which memes become successful. And so I'll get into that a little bit. And the reason why authorless matters is because a lot of politicians approach doing memes online like they would approach creating a postcard campaign, or doing mailers, or having someone go to door and hand, the pamphlet. Good memes are authorless and don't always, endorse a candidate. Sometimes they just make you want to think about why coconuts, or what's up with that couch that Vance was interested in purchasing, of course. And I talk about this moment as the static age, not just because it's an amazing Misfit song, but also because we are beyond information overload. We're now, 20 years into the social media experiment. We are no longer overloaded with information, but we are actually enmeshed in static. It's static all the time. And so memes and other kinds of media that wants to break through the static has to be somewhat unexpected. And here, of course, because of Chicago, I have to bring up Max Headroom and how one night, November 22nd, 1987, there were 2 short transmissions over television stations, and nobody to this day knows who was in the Max Headroom mask or how they managed to take over TV signals. But it did turn into this very big national security concern about, well, what happens if a foreign entity or a domestic terrorist decides to take over television? And of course, there are media to that effect. Hollywood has really played that out. But it's those moments when something reaches out beyond, feels unexpected, feels novel, feels outrageous, that pulls us in. And I feel like that's a context that really plays well with meme wars, because people are going to share memes that they feel are somewhat unexpected or in a way cerebral or or frankly outrageous. So there hasn't been a lot of great research on what's happening on social media platforms, primarily because researchers have been locked out of platforms now for the past couple of years. APIs, that is how we interface with social media, has become really hard to get access to and extremely expensive. But one of the best studies came out of Oxford Internet Institute in 2020, where they documented cyber troops in 81 countries. So cyber troops are government or political party actors tasked with manipulating public opinion online. So that to me is more of a net war problem than it is anything related to cyber warfare. Where cyber warfare, they're really trying to take down the power grid, they want to disrupt things in society. But cyber troops use social media and the internet as it is designed. They're not hacking, while employing social engineering techniques like impersonation, bots, and growth hacking. And it's different from hacking or other forms of cyber warfare, which directly attack opponents or infrastructure. And yearly, there are millions and millions of dollars spent on platforms using their advertising systems to break out of echo chambers and reach new audiences. The last number I heard, that there were 63,000 different ways to segment an audience on Facebook. So if you wanted to, target people who are recently engaged in the South Side, that also have interest in diabetes supplies, you'll be able to, get that fine granularity through just the systems as they're built. So I'm arguing essentially that social media is no longer a simulation. We are always online, our phones are always on, we are always reachable, we live in this technologically dense environment. And now with social media, we're living in a splintered reality. And so these are both posts related to the Gaza conflict, where these pictures are all AI generated. And especially the devastation, car on fire, these kinds of things don't need to be made up, right? There's plenty of devastation to go around. But what's interesting about AI is that in this one, especially where you have these children, it's evoking a lot of emotional feelings of sympathy, but AI won't create gore. And so you notice this is a very violent situation, but there's no blood, right? It makes no sense, but nevertheless, these are some of the telltale signs that AI is at work, is that, people might have, 10 and a half fingers and 3 arms, but one of the other signs is that nobody's bloody in a war zone, which doesn't make any sense. So in the past, our mainstream media has thought about how its media strategy is going to work by placing itself in the center and using social media platforms to distribute their posts. So this is from the New York Times, one publisher, 7 days, 9 platforms, 1,600 posts. And mainstream media have essentially adopted the web as another kind of distribution system where it's much like broadcast, one to many. But what's different about online media that, younger people often don't even realize that they've gone through this change because they've embraced and only seen media through this type of participatory media framework. So with the internet, we are typically using rhizomatic communication, which is the simultaneous use of multiple channels for collecting, sorting, and broadcasting information to raise awareness or coordinate action across platforms. It's a horizontal and nodal distribution, so we don't always know where the sources are, we don't always know where our media is coming from. And the right wing has adopted participatory media model for sharing their stories. You'll notice on the right wing, there are very rarely any paywalls. Most of the content is completely free although Fox News is experimenting with a paid subscription platform, as is, I think, the Daily Caller. But for the most part, it's not behind a paywall. It is readily available. And instead of placing themselves in the center, they see their audience as a distribution system. So whereas New York Times sees at the endpoint as posting on a platform, the right wing sees delivering the news to their audience as the beginning of the distribution network. And that's why the right wing is so good at, getting people to click, like, share, and subscribe. As well, you don't run into those pesky paywalls. And so you see that the form of news on the right wing has been able to be shifted and moved away from being a commercial property and is much more reminiscent of how a social movement operates online, because social movements also use participatory media. So in today's net war, we have reporters out there like Xian at BBC's Verify that will spend quite a bit of time every day debunking stories. So this one's from October 7th, where he was able to show very quickly that a story that people were circulating of a building being blown up was actually from May 2021, right? And in studying how disinformation operates and how media manipulation happens, we've been able to map quite a few different tactics that get deployed across participatory media. This here is called recontextualized media, but also imposter accounts. I've seen fake fact checks, misinfographics, manipulated video, trolling and degrading, evidence collages, hijacked accounts, as well as hollow sourcing, which means that you kind of go back time and time again saying anonymous sources say. You can do that we can have a little bit of hollow sourcing as a treat, but you cannot do it, for the entirety of a series or many stories, because it starts to look like you're just making things up. So when I'm thinking about this moment in time that we're going through, I'm often really trying to bridge how we talk about participatory media and its effects when there is a call to action. So networked incitement refers to a socio-technical infrastructure where participatory media is utilized to command and control mobilized social movements in the moment of action. And I'm going to show you how this starts. It's the clearest example is January 6th, but I'll go into a couple of other examples and then round it out with Springfield. So we did this study on networked incitement, and we looked at all of the different court records of people that got arrested at January 6th, affidavits, things that they said in court, looking for motivation. What brought them there? Some people said, I just wanted to see what was going to happen. Other people said, I'm there for the violence. But about 1/5 of people went because Trump had sent this tweet. They would talk about Trump calling us to fight. So this is the infamous "will be wild" tweet, where he was publishing a report from Peter Navarro, who had gone to jail recently, where Navarro was claiming that election fraud had happened. But this, big protest in DC on January 6th, "Be There, Will Be Wild," became the sort of media's probably most important example that Trump was actually behind the organizing of that protest. And what happened on that day was very mimetic even in itself. So as far as I know, Trump is the only president that has his own flag. But flags are memes in and of themselves. They denote insider, outsider. We don't necessarily think about them as having an author, and that you know it when you see it. So when you look at the pictures from that day, you can see people enacting out visions of how they think this revolution is going to go down, including people dressed as, colonizing patriots, right? This whole idea that 1776 will rise again. people were enacting that, like living through the meme. And this man in the corner is very disheveled, but he looks like a vigilante. He's got his helmet on, he's got goggles on, and he is carrying an American flag that he no doubt took from the rotunda. So what happens in that moment is really interesting, because you have a couple of hours of rioting in the Capitol, and then Trump goes on Twitter at 4:17 p.m. and posts, it's a video, he says, "I know your pain, I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side, but you have to go home now. We love you, you're very special, we've seen what happens, you see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel, but go home and go in peace." And over the next half hour, this tweet is shared amongst people inside the Capitol, and they start to walk out, single file. It's one of the most amazing things, and they're saying to police officers, "We'll be back, next time we'll bring guns." But there was this orderly, and given the chaos of what happened earlier, this like orderly march out of the institution because Trump had told them to leave. And what that points me to is thinking about, in the wider context, okay, we have this very clear example of networked incitement that plays out on the day of January 6th. But what else is happening, and where else can we see it? So networked incitement seems to have a logic or a process where a person fans the flame of the culture wars by dehumanizing marginalized groups. They name a target that is a person or a place that represents that group on social media, and they encourage their audience to troll or investigate the target. And what we know now about an account like Libs of TikTok, which is infamous on Twitter, is that once she names and shames a doctor or a school, that bomb threats follow. So almost immediately within the hour of her posting, you have bomb threats and schools being shut down, hospitals being shut down. And what that ends up leading to is that schools and hospitals then become very reticent to advertise that they're doing certain treatment. I mean, the Children's Hospital in Boston removed the webpage for gender affirming care because they do not want to be targeted by people who are invested in this kind of networked incitement model. Even in Boston, there was an in-person protest in front of Children's Hospital because of the dust-up caused by Libs of TikTok. And it's not that Libs of TikTok is going online saying, "Go harass this doctor." It's much more an artifact of what it means to be a troll, and that trolls know that this is the appropriate action to take. So let's talk about cats and memes, and I'll make it all make sense eventually. So you might have noticed that there was this big thing that happened. Everybody was like talking about being childless cat ladies. I'm child-free, not childless. And obviously cats are amazing, so I don't even know. I don't even know why we have to debate this. But there was an interview with Fox News host Tucker Carlson with then Senate candidate J.D. Vance in 2021, where Vance said that the country was being run by Democrats, corporate oligarchs, and a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives, the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. Obviously, a man who's never had a cat, right? Because they're so soft and cuddly. Like, you cannot be miserable and have cats in your life. Doesn't make any sense. But I digress, because it became a meme, right? On the Harris side of the aisle, it was, we are fiercely childless cat ladies. Child-free would have been a better way to talk about it. But it doesn't start there, actually. It actually starts with the suffragette movement. And if you think about memes over time, memes do have these timeless qualities. So these were posters that were put out during the suffragette movement, basically suggesting that women who were suffragettes were like cats, right? This cat crying, I want my vote. Obviously, the cats represent the domesticization of the household. So you've got this weirdo pouring boiling water next to a baby. Like, move it to the counter. Underneath it says the suffragette not at home, and of course there's a cat in the photo here. The suffragette down with the tomcats, right? This idea that women and cats are sneaky and anti-men, which doesn't make a ton of sense because I've had cats that like men. It doesn't, but anyway. And then I'm a suffragette because there was a lot of violence perpetrated against the suffragette movement. Yeah. And what they did is they actually took the meme and inverted it. So here they put a hat on the cat. It's adorable, right? And they're like, yeah, you can want to make us into cats? We'll do this. And they also made posters about the Cat and Mouse Act, which unfortunately was what would happen is women would be arrested and they'd be brought into jail, and then they'd go on a hunger strike in the jail. They would beat them and force feed them. So it started to become what is known as the Cat and Mouse Act, where suffragettes would get caught, and then the police would have to let them go because there had been enough fervor about force feeding the women. So they were able to take the meme and invert the meaning of it and make it more of their own. As well, we also know about witches and black cats, where badass women apparently used to be able to ride on broomsticks, and cats would like ride on them, which is crazy to me, but it happened because there's pictures of it. I'm kidding. But I bring it up just to say that even like if we go further back in history about what does a cat represent, people believe that witches had these familiars and that the cats were really sneaky. So the cats can go and hang out with the men, and the men don't know that the cats are actually going to go back and tell the women what had happened. So this idea that the cats themselves were against the patriarchy. I'm down for it, but nevertheless, as the meme goes, they weren't burning witches, they were burning women. So what does it all have to do with the Trump campaign? I'm not going to read you the entire post from J.D. Vance, but the day of the Harris-Trump debate, he started to tweet about, and people online that were part of the right wing started to talk about Springfield migrants, Haitian migrants in Springfield eating the cats and dogs. And Vance said this earlier in the morning. He said, in short, don't let the crybabies in the media dissuade you, fellow patriots. Keep the cat memes flowing. So again, what he was doing then is calling people in to become part of the meme wars. So very quickly, people started to use AI to put Trump cats and ducks into an airplane together. That was a weird one. And then there was this other post that did incredible numbers from an account called End Wokeness, where they claim that this man walking across the street had taken this geese from the park when actually he was clearing up roadkill and he was just moving it to the side of the street. And there had been simultaneously a post on Facebook that had gone ultra viral about this woman saying she couldn't find her cat and she believed that her neighbors had killed it and were going to eat it. Turns out, Miss Sassy in the basement, right? Crazy. But nevertheless, this becomes the evidentiary basis for the right wing to mobilize this entire inversion of what it means to do cat warfare. And then the memes keep coming. So you start to see the Gadsden flag, and you see a lot of Springfield's, the Simpsons references. Of course, you guys remember Alf. He's the actual alien that eats cats. Musk gets in on it, and he starts posting Simpsons memes. And then you start to see more and more of the AI schlock circulating. So MAGA cats with AK-47s, Cat Lives Matter, Trump as Captain America with a bunch of kittens. I'd rather you grabbed me than ate me. These are all like polite work time memes. These are not some the grosser ones. But you can see that they've taken the cat meme, cat lady thing, and then just inverted it and also made it really xenophobic, because cats also represent, as I was sort of gesturing to you, a softness and a helpless animal. And so what happens after that, is very similar to what happens after Libs of TikTok posts, is that there's a bunch of bomb threats in Springfield. The city hall's shut down, the schools are shut down, the college is shut down. There were over 30 different bomb threats called in to different places in Springfield, as well as other kinds of threats, including threats from overseas. So it wasn't just Americans calling in these violent threats, but that they were coming from outside the country, which points to me that this is much larger than just, a couple of kids doing a prank, right? This is actual net war. This is warfare being played out in front of your eyes, and the town was frozen. There was a Proud Boys group that was trying to have a rally called the Pissed Off Americans March. They had gotten 300 people on Facebook to reply to it. It ended up being a dud, but nevertheless, people were afraid that the Proud Boys were going to come to Springfield. So I'm going to wrap up on this point, which is that, interestingly, and I don't know which way this is going to go, there are Haitian groups in Springfield suing for damages for this kind of disinformation campaign. And it'll be interesting to find out if they are awarded any kind of damages, or there is a inquiry into what really happened here. Ultimately, though, the takeaway here is that the product is the policy. So when you ask, someone like me, what can we do about it? How can we get technology companies to be more careful? How can we, move society along so that we don't have these sort of weapons of psychological warfare at the fingertips of anyone and everyone that wants to use social media? And until such time that we have regulation, the product stands as it is. And this goes for every technology that gets deployed. The reason why they're shoving AI into everything that you're using is because they want you to not think of a life without it, right? Because it becomes way harder to regulate technology once it's been deployed. But I'll tell you, in the AI realm, when it comes to how it sees you and how it knows you and how it replicates you, it's doing it all with biometrics, right? They're not taking pictures of you and making the mouth move. They're taking very precise measurements of your body and your face. And so we do need to have laws that protect us from this. And then lastly, I'll say, someone's got a notification on Slack. Lastly, I'll say that Trump really put himself in charge of Twitter decency standards back when he was in office. And I'm going to just close that. And no longer an emerging technology imbued with the possibility of fostering social change by giving voice to small groups, social media has become a tool of the powerful to dominate, harass, and coerce vulnerable groups. And if we don't acknowledge this shift, the freest speech will benefit only those who are already powerful. So thank you.
Thank you, Joan. It's so fun to present with you always. That's so amazing and interesting. And I'm going to talk about Springfield also, but from a slightly different point of view. And thank you, Joe, for putting this together. Always a delight to be here. Familiar ground in Hyde Park. Okay, so as we discussed before, we have this snippet about Trump saying they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people who live here, which he said about Springfield. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the last part of this quote, which is the idea of the people who live there. Because what this quote does is mobilize an idea of an American white polity that excludes a variety of people. That seems to be rapidly growing, right? So this at least excludes people who might also live here, but who are not in this quote seen to be legitimate Americans, whether that is refugees and immigrants, or whether we get all the way up to the Madison Square Garden version by Stephen Miller that we'll talk about at the end, where he said, America is for Americans only, which is sort of the crystallization of this idea. So my first book is about the white power movement, which is a organized group of Klansmen, neo-Nazis, tax protesters, Posse Comitatus members, militiamen, skinheads, etc., who came together after the Vietnam War to wage war on the federal government. They did that because they thought the door to politics was closed. They thought that there was no way that a political action could ever return the kinds of things that they sought to establish. And therefore they said, the time for the ballot has passed, now is the time for the bullet, which is quoting Mao, but they kind of go around Mao. Anyway, so that's different than what we might think about as white nationalism proper, which is, I think, better understood as the attempt to enshrine within the existing frame of the United States a white cultural, political, religious, and citizenship framework. So it has to do with whether you're inside of institutions or outside of institutions. It has to do with degree of violence. And then it also has to do with whether we're talking about the United States as the end category for a white ethno-state. So for the white power movement, they're interested in a white ethno-state, but they think that that could be anywhere. And they see the nation in white nationalism as the Aryan nation. Okay, so that's the 1980s. Okay, historians think about that in this broader category of white supremacy, which also includes individual racist belief, systems, and institutions that continue to return racial inequality. So I mentioned that just to say that we, in many cases, are dealing with ingrained white supremacy that doesn't require anybody participating to be racist personally in order to achieve unequal outcomes. We could think about maternal health outcomes, incarceration rates, the gap in summer learning loss. There's all kinds of places where you don't need racist actors in order to sort of observe that we remain in a white supremacist system. Okay, so within individual belief, there is the subcategory of white power activism, which is people who believe that they are themselves racist, they will tell you that proudly, and who will take action to violently defend their race from what they see as extinction. That overlaps with white nationalism, and then white nationalism also pulls us into systems and institutions and governance. Okay, which brings us to Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller, in the first Trump administration, is a very good example of someone who is white nationalist proper. He's inside of the state and in its institutions. He's not taking violent action to undermine the federal government per se, but he is pursuing what we can see as a clearly white nationalist policy agenda. Things like implementing border policies that are deliberately designed to harm border crossers, like instituting bans on immigration from particular countries in order to achieve a white body politic or protect a white body politic, concerns about the white birth rate. These are all kind of markers of white nationalist policy. He also is on the record promoting this book, Camp of the Saints, which is a novel about the idea that a flood of immigrants entering Europe from Islamic countries would mean the end of Western civilization and all of its, achievements. Okay, so the question I want to ask today is, how do we get from here, right, where Stephen Miller is circulating this book but maintaining some degree of plausible deniability and dog whistle sort of distance from outright racism, to here, last Sunday at Madison Square Garden, where he participated in a rally that is deliberately convened to mimic a Nazi event held there, a Nazi supporting rally held there in 1939, and to say things like America is for Americans and Americans only, which is by any definition kind of like the most overt declaration of this ideology that he has made. So a lot of things happened between these two moments, right? After Trump's declaration of his candidacy, when he famously came down the escalator and said that Mexico was sending rapists into the United States, this problem of the white power movement / white nationalism burst into our political discourse with Charlottesville. This is the Unite the Right rally in 2017. This is the Tiki Torches, where they said, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us." You will notice that these are, I love the idea of flags as memes. Mm-hmm. These memes are obviously racist memes, right? You cannot be more overt than the swastika flag. You'll see also Confederate flags there, etc. And of course, this had fatalities right away and was followed by a whole bunch of what we still refer to as lone wolf terrorist events. In other talks sometime, or I'm happy to send you references, let's just not say lone wolf anymore. When we're talking about the white power movement, this is all socially networked and coordinated violence. It shares ideology, it shares languages, it shares weapons. They are literally cutting and pasting from each other's manifestos. So we see a string of these. Christchurch is in New Zealand. Purportedly, that's Islamophobic violence. Tree of Life, anti-Semitic violence. The El Paso Walmart shooting, anti-Latinx violence. Buffalo's anti-Black violence. They are all those things, but they are all carried out by white power actors. Alongside of this, there's also a story about underground guerrilla activity. Most prominently, the attacks on the power grid that are starting to be reported as white power violence. If you have not been following, this is a sort of nationwide peppering of attacks on power infrastructure by shooting at it. It is still under investigation. I can't yet tell you all the details, but what we do know is that they're finding evidence of like significant weapons, and it's coordinated, and it follows, do you remember the name of the pamphlet? It follows two different pamphlets urging white power activists to do this. Okay. And there is like the old school underground paramilitary training and readiness of guerrilla armies. All of this is rumbling along as the Trump administration part one is getting going in the early 2016, 17, 18. Okay, so the earlier movement was using disaffected veterans and, more importantly, the story of the Vietnam War to pull together all of these activists and make their case for attacking the government. This is still at play in a moment where we're dealing with the long aftermath of the global war on terror. For those of you who are older in this room, our undergrads are now way beyond memory of 9/11, but we were at war for most of my adult life. It also mobilizes religion, it mobilizes a variety of symbols and groups in order to sort of bring people into this movement. Again, this is the 1980s. And in the 80s, it had a very clear set of social issues that for white power activists all came back to the defense of whiteness. So for people in this movement, opposing abortion, opposing immigration, opposing gay rights, feminism, all was about protecting white babies and the white birth rate. All of it at the end of the day was about the white birth rate. So something like this, which is a very common cartoon that was reprinted across white power publications, would appear next to concerns about abortion, interracial marriage, women's rights, et cetera, down the line. But all of it had to do with the idea of being overwhelmed. And for people in this movement, that was seen as an apocalyptic emergency, right? They believed that the race is their nation, and that if the race disappears, they are gone from the earth. And for many people, they thought of this as part of a religious ideology called Christian identity that posited that their job was not only to survive this time of tribulation and racial threat, but to take up arms and clear the world of non-white people, Jews, and racial enemies before Christ could return in the end times, which is a whole, we can get into it in the Q&A if you want to. Whole other thing for today. So in the 1980s, intensive immigration, much like now, they did things like the Klan Border Watch. This is part of something called Operation Hemline, which was to defend the southern border of the United States from people crossing it. If you're noticing that that is a directly sexualized thing that recalls this Mexicans are sending rapists language, you are correct. They also got very worried about what we have colloquially referred to as the boat people, which is groups of Vietnamese refugees who fled Vietnam and neighboring countries after the Vietnam War to the United States, mostly because they were in danger of reprisal if they stayed in Vietnam. People who had been American allies, people who had opposed the regime, et cetera. So these refugees came to the United States mostly through sponsorship programs and therefore were settled kind of all around the country. but then did secondary migrations of their own to parts of the country that they thought would be good places to live. One of these was the Galveston coast in Texas, which had a familiar climate, it had a familiar economy, and it had fishing and shrimping as its major industries, which a lot of the boat people had participated in their home country. So they moved there. They largely were able to outfish the white fishermen by living together in large groups, by eating like the unsellable fish from what they caught, and by working incredibly long days that the white fishermen would not work. The white fishermen got enormously worried about this, and campaigns of, well, not campaigns yet, but altercations broke out along this coastline. And then the Klan came in and decided to train the white fishermen in paramilitary combat so that they could better defend their community from these refugees. To do this, they used the language of the Vietnam War. You'll see this guy has made a Klan hood out of paramilitary camo fatigue material. Here they are burning a boat painted the USS Viet Cong. So they claimed that the refugees were Viet Cong. They said they had lots of stolen gold that they had brought into the country illegally. They said they were secretly wealthy. They did a whole bunch of conspiracy theory. And significantly, they made the argument that these refugees were unassimilable because they ate rats. Okay, so the idea of refugees eating inappropriate food and being unassimilable and using this as a wedge to create a violent altercation is out of an old playbook. It goes with paramilitary training camps. I don't have pictures of the one in Texas. There's three like this in Texas. This is in North Carolina, but same set of groups. And it goes with a whole bunch of other sort of tried and true mechanisms from the earlier white power movement. So when we think about the particular notion of the immigrants and the refugees in Springfield eating the pets, we also have to think about the circulation of this particular one. So in March, there is a rally of a group called Blood Tribe, which I will talk about a little bit later. They talk about immigrants eating the pets. Vance reads a letter about it on July 9th. Libs of TikTok retweets July 12th. Blood Tribe shows up again to give testimony to the city council. That's the clip you've probably seen from Springfield of the guy with the beard talking about it being a problem. Vance amplifies, Trump amplifies, and then we get the story that Joan was talking about Klan, Proud Boys, Blood Tribe, bomb threats. And significantly, we have Vance saying, this story is not true, but I will do what I have to do to get the media to pay attention to the problem of immigration. So we have the full arc of this thing. This is Blood Tribe. Both of these groups, important to know. So when you see the guy talking to city council, he looks like that. This is also what they look like when they are drilling. Blood Tribe is a neo-Nazi group that had previously gotten kicked out of Maine for attempting to organize a paramilitary training facility there. There's an excellent long read about it in Atavist this week, if you would like to go and read some more. It's quite good. So Blood Tribe doing both of these things. Okay, so to get to where we are, we have to think about the full arc of the intersection between white power activism, which is this, and white nationalist activism, which is like Stephen Miller's border policies, right? Not the same thing, but they are now coming together to create a sort of new set of problems. Whatever we think about, well, it is clear that the first Trump administration has really changed the sort of possibility set for white power groups, right? The door to mainstream politics is not closed anymore. There is no moment like the one in 1983 where they say like, oh, we can't achieve what we want, so we have to do war on the state. That door is wide open. They can certainly pursue war on the state as they like, but they also can pursue policy making. So what we see is people figuring out what that relationship is going to be. So for instance, in the presidential debate in 2020, when Trump sort of infamously said, "Proud Boys, stand back, stand by," which called them to action, they immediately went and made t-shirts that said, "Stand back, stand by," said, "We're ready, Mr. President." They also started doing a whole bunch of stuff that began to integrate them into the GOP command structure. Since then, they have been doing things like provide security at GOP events. They've been running for office themselves. They've been doing school board actions. They are pretty well integrated into particular places within the GOP, like Florida. So this is no longer a clear division. There is a relationship. They also famously came out for Trump on January 6th. This is the Proud Boys in the yellow hats in this picture. I guess they would say yellow. I think they look orange.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be yellow. Anyhow, that's them. And you'll notice that they are small in number, but they are highly organized. They showed up not just as casual observers, but prepared to do violence. They are the ones who organized the breach of the building. And they are overwhelmingly the people who have been convicted for seditious conspiracy and sort of proven to have bigger plans than just causing chaos that day. Oath Keepers has a similar story, although I'm not going to get into it right now, but here's the Oath Keepers in their tactical readiness gear. We're going to do that later. We're going to do that later. All of this is later. Okay. Meanwhile, the white nationalist side of things has become more and more overt about its embrace of the organized and violent white power movement. For instance, Trump kicked off his campaign for this cycle in Waco. Waco should make you think immediately of sort of an anti-government sensibility because of the standoff there with the Branch Davidians in 1993. That is true, that is right. But there is something bigger and more significant about that selection as well. And you'll see in the background of this slide, he's, I believe this is when he was listening to the national anthem sung by the January 6th choir of prisoners. But also he's got January 6th up on a big screen behind him. So not only is this not, it's not just sort of the revision of January 6th into quote unquote a normal tourist visit, right? It's the embrace of January 6th. And you'll see in the signs for this one a whole bunch of stuff about witch hunt, about being framed, about righteous patriots being detained unfairly as part of a political project. Waco also means something different within the white power movement, particularly among activists who are likely to take violent action. This is Timothy McVeigh, who would go on to bomb the Oklahoma City Federal Building in 1995 at the roadblock outside of the Waco siege in 1993. Waco was a radicalizing event, and it is understood in this movement as an outright call to violence. To hold an event there is not just vaguely anti-government or anti-federal government, it is an incitement. And it leads to this. Madison Square Garden, similarly, is not just a site of large events in New York, as has been reported. It is directly about mimicking and restaging this pro-Nazi rally that took place there in 1939. There have, as some commentators have pointed out, there have been non-Nazi presidential related events there in the meantime. A lot of people have events in Madison Square Garden, including a variety of bands, sports teams and stuff. But you can see really clearly how this is visually the same thing, right? And the other way we know that is that Miller and others are standing up and saying things that include America for Americans and Americans only. So it's all of that. 1 second. Yeah, so part of what I think we have to contend with now, and I'm gonna just put this on the table and then we can look at my other pictures later if we want to, is this move away from Well, okay, so what does it mean if that door to mainstream political process is open? It means that not only do we have to be concerned about the road to action that leads to Oklahoma City attacks on communities of color and Jewish congregations and other acts of underground violence, it means we also have to be thinking about authoritarian threats to our institutions, about threats to the American experiment, the right to one person, one vote, and about kind of the set of things that come with authoritarian meaning in our politics. The other thing that I think we have to think about, especially after Madison Square Garden, I'm going back because we should look at it one more time, is that the idea of plausible deniability, the idea that Trump should have to use dog whistles, the idea that there is a kind of bright line that he would not cross, that is gone. That started to slip before the Waco rally, but it's just gone. So what does that mean? I think should be our first question for what comes next. If there's no need to distance oneself from Hitler, if there's no need to distance oneself from some of the more odious parts of this rhetoric, I think it sets up a number of questions that are very, very concerning about whether the election is even the point of this kind of a machination. Okay, so I will leave it there, and we can talk some more.
Terrifying.
Girl, please.
Okay.
So please ready your questions and comments, but maybe before we get into that, do either of you have a question you want to put on the table right now towards one another?
Yeah. Okay, so I really liked the graphic of the New York Times. We don't have to keep looking at Madison Square Garden. I like the graphic of the New York Times pushing the story out versus is it a ginger root?
Yeah.
The rhizomatic movement of information through networks.
Yeah.
It occurs to me that also says something really important about authorship of the story. Because if it's the New York Times, it's one journalistically fact-checked and produced story that's then just put a lot of places, right? The other thing seems to me to have a lot more capacity for participant involvement as it moves down those channels. Is that right?
Yeah, and it you see it, rhizomatic communication often is how social movements communicate online. So social movements don't think about any one platform as their only space, because you'd be crazy to just hope that Facebook doesn't erase your entire movement, doing some kind of content moderation. So movements often think about platforms as overlapping but not overlaying, because you're also going to get different audiences whether you're on Tumblr or Reddit or X. And so movements were really good at adopting this. You can think back to the structure of the Occupy movement, for instance, where almost anyone could rise to the center at any day if they had a good enough idea or if they were calling for some kind of social action. Steve Bannon is an interesting person because he is a sort of a student of the Occupy movement. So Steve Bannon and Andrew Breitbart made a movie called Occupy Unmasked, and if you watch it, everything they say in that movie about Anonymous is the same exact shit they were saying in 2016 about Antifa, right? And so they really know how to paint a boogeyman and then utilize those same networks to engender all kinds of chaos and rage. And so Bannon, there's another way of telling this story where Bannon is at these integral points, pushing communication through these networks and using a whole host of media manipulation tactics, including online advertising. He owned one of the most frequently visited weather websites that he was able to power his war room and his podcast by having people just go to this site and look up the weather. And you didn't know that it was paying Steve Bannon's salary, right? That's something that researchers at Check My Ads found out, which is a really great nonprofit. So yeah, the capacity for participating in the story making, and also the risk that you can take. It can pay off either monetarily or with political clout, right? Think about Stephen Miller and others, they start to move closer to the center, not just because, they're interested in politics, but also because they're using social media and other forms of communication to become more relevant. And that is a consequence of this participatory media design. So it's unfortunate, but people say, Obama was the first social media president, but I don't agree. I think Trump was really able to think about social media as a distribution mechanism. And when you said you wonder if the election is the point, I don't think it is. When you said that, it hurts to say this, but it's not that anybody on that side of Trump is at all interested in a free and fair election, right? Because politics are a game, right? And you can game the system. And Trump is on the record saying all kinds of things about, being a millionaire and gaming the system, and and that's why he's so successful. And I think if you approach politics not as this, or democracies as not as this process, but as a game where you can brute force your way into power, I think that's very different. But I was interested in hearing your thoughts on what Trump did last night with Liz Cheney, and made a very clear threat that she should be facing a firing squad to test her courage.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody's seen this. It was basically let's see how brave she is when she has X number of weapons pointed at her, and I think even bullets flying at her face, right?
Yeah.
They've been talking about killing Liz Cheney a lot, but of course to have a presidential candidate say it and put it like that, I just think it's another example of how far beyond the pale we are. I think that even a couple of months ago, he wouldn't have said it that way, and there might have been more of a resistance to it. And part of it is just I don't know about all of you, but it has really felt like, we were talking about this earlier, the intensity of the election media has felt so overpowering in the last week or two that something like that can happen, and it's not drop everything. Trump just said they should assassinate Liz Cheney, right? But that's definitely what he said. And I as you were saying, I think people who might take violent action will definitely hear that as go try and assassinate Liz Cheney. There are real ramifications to this kind of speech.
There's also something interesting about the 2 assassination attempts against Trump and the backgrounds of those people, because the first one, he was a Republican in name, but he was definitely an accelerationist.
Yeah.
And I think he thought killing either candidate would be a worthwhile venture. And then the other one that was hanging out in the bushes, he is also a Republican and was a Trump supporter. So it's weird to see them sort of eating their own kind in a way, and it strikes me that Trump is such an unusual candidate that even the typical party mechanisms that would rein someone in so they don't say that they'd like to murder, Cheney's, anybody. Yeah, the typical party mechanisms that would restrain that just don't work on Trump.
Right.
And so, who are you going to have? Mitch McConnell show up and be like, dude, stop it, right? It's not going to happen.
The other interesting part of the white power movement part of this story, we're talking about a very small number of people, but a very highly committed, ideologically motivated and violent group of people. And I'm not at all sure that they are, devoted followers of Trump so much as they are looking for a window through which to shove their own activism, right? So like, and that's how the Klan and groups like this have always worked. But I think it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to be, like, were Trump to disappear from this equation tomorrow through whatever mechanism, whether it's incarceration or some other outcome, this doesn't go away because it will funnel to whatever the next opportunity is. So.
Yeah. Ask a quick question on you've given us two presentations that are about amplification in different registers. So one is the question of social media amplification and all the techniques that you've shown us about in terms of staging a mode of communication that always seems to assume an ever larger audience. And you've talked about how the movement from white power to white nationalism has just moved itself into the center and is increasingly talking as if it has, a full political authorization in a way, and is acting with that. So the question is, what are the proper modes of responding to these kinds of amplifications? I think for a long time in media worlds, it's a fact checking. Right? You show that in fact people aren't eating cats, and that's supposed to solve the problem. But across both your presentations today, there's been this constant attention to the code switching that is happening and the multivalent symbolisms that are mobilized so that communication can happen to specific groups in ways that up until maybe this last week had to be kind of crouched and hidden and allowed a plausible deniability. So the big question I have is, if the fact-checking and the truth-telling doesn't put a dent in these movements, then do you see other alternatives of reaction, and how might all of us think about using the long narratives you've both given us around the techniques of amplification to do something else?
Oh, historian's not going to solve it? I saw the eyes there. It was like that glint. So I think it's a really important moment to talk about what's also happening outside of this rise in white nationalism and moving whiteness more prolifically to the core of American politics, where some of you are sitting here saying, no duh, right? Like, it's always been white nationalism, but there are different ways of describing it and different ways of talking about structural racism and policy. But I do feel that this moment is qualitatively different. And the way that I mark that is we have fewer and fewer truth tellers. So one of the things that happened right after October 7th is you had all these university presidents pulled in front of Congress to talk about anti-Semitism on campus. That led to 3 university presidents resigning. But what we didn't talk about is that following that, at least 24 schools adopted institutional neutrality positions. And what happens when our institutions don't speak up for the truth and don't have a voice is that we actually allow what would be moral authorities to move out of their role and accountability for saying this is wrong and we are a moral institution and we believe that something should be done, and you give it over to moral entrepreneurs, people who are going to say, well, if the LA Times is not going to do this, I will take a stand, right? Or if the Washington Post is not going to do this, let it be me to go out there. And so it's not that institutional neutrality is anything new, but we do see a lot of our institutions at the moment where we need moral authorities to come in and say, this is fascism, this doesn't resemble fascism, this is fascism, or this doesn't resemble the American way that we typically think about democracy as being an exchange of power without violence, a process of ensuring peace in tougher times, let's say. So I do think that when I think about where we need to go from here, we need to have these institutional moral authorities step into the breach and say, yeah, this has been fact-checked, this has been refuted, we have reminded you that this has been refuted, but now we are going to stand on our principles and let you know that this isn't okay and this isn't normal and we're not going to let this pass without, taking a position one way or another. And, we know here at U Chicago, that's a very time-honored tradition of institutional neutrality. But I do think that we hand over the reins or the opportunity to be influential and impactful, and we skirt being accountable for the role that institutions are supposed to play in society. Not an easy answer. We could also just blow up the power grid.
Joan!
I'm sorry. I just was thinking on my feet.
I think the other part of it is that what something like Madison Square, we have to change the frame of analysis and engagement, because Madison Square Garden isn't just that Steve Miller is now embracing white power ideology openly and that Donald Trump is fascist and that everybody seems to be totally cool with that in that building. It's that we are now operating in such a disconnect that either people voting for Trump don't believe any of that just happened, or that they're fine with that. And that is a profound rift. Both of those are profound rifts in the way that we, and even the starting point to having a university or having a newspaper or having a conversation about politics. And we've all felt that coming. I don't want to speak for everybody. Many of us have felt that coming over the years at the Thanksgiving dinner table with that one uncle, or on Facebook with the people you can't talk to from high school anymore, or whatever it is, right? But these rifts are in many ways, I think, historically unprecedented, at least in modern American society. And I think that it's a whole different thing now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. We have some time for some questions, and we need to use the microphone for the recording. So, please.
Hi, thank you very much for that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michelle Lowry, and I work on ancient Rome. This year, I'm the interim director of the Franke Institute. I want to make an announcement for an event that I think might mesh well with yours on November 15th. We have Nick Lemon coming from the Columbia Journalism School and from the New Yorker to talk about the promise and peril of political narratives. And I'm interested specifically in the question of how it is that people know what to do when they're not told what to do. Where is that I think there are two overlapping things. One is that we don't know what the truth is anymore. And two, everyone nevertheless knows the story. And I just want to share, because I've been my role as a classicist, I'm very interested in ancient rhetoric and seeing how it still works today. There's a statement by Quintilian that an exemplum, which I think works a lot like a meme, it's a kind of little ideological node where there's a narrative that's implied that doesn't have to be spoken. An exemplum, he defines it as the telling of an event that happened or as if happened. Mm-hmm. to persuade people to do what you want. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm thinking in there is that there is some persistent narrative, which I think one can see in your talk by coming back to Waco, coming back to the place where there's something implied that's not spoken, and that there's a question of what is some kind of plausibility. An event may have happened or not happened, it doesn't matter the truth of it, but it has to be plausible to the people who are consuming it. So But I'm not sure that the two of you agree on how it is that people know what the implied either narrative or story or set of instructions or whatever it is. So I'd like to hear the two of you hash that out.
Yeah, I mean, I just simply think about it as a process of enculturation, similar though to like how Dick Hebdige describes subcultural knowledge. So you're kind of immersed in it. And so for very clear genealogy of the bomb threats come out of what happened during Gamergate. So like, if you didn't like what another gamer was saying, you would call the cops and say there's a crime being committed at that person's house. And they would send the SWAT team in. And then you would be able to watch on that gamer's live stream the cops show up and like pin them to the ground and say, where's the hostage? And so that kind of swatting behavior and calling in bomb threats or calling in other kinds of crimes, trying to get police response is something that was habituated and circulated throughout like early, the sort of moment when gaming went out of the living room and into the internet. And so those practices are learned behaviors once you become part of these subcultures. So for instance, David Hogg from March for Our Lives, he used to be a student at Harvard when I was there, and he told me about the day he got swatted, and it was, it's not like he was living his life as a public figure ahead of time. Like his parents' property records were online, easily accessible. Mm-hmm. So when he had been on one of the TV shows or something, and then within the next hour or two, the SWAT team was at his house because they suspected there was a crime happening. And, they had been told explicitly there was a crime happening. And so, but you learn that that kind of behavior comes out of these trolling communities that do this more regularly.
And before that, I mean, yes, I do agree. And before that, I think these cultural frames for violence were part of leaderless resistance and other sort of asymmetrical warfare tactics of the white power movement in the 80s. And then they're coming from novels, they're coming from other activists, from phone and recorded hate lines, from newsletters. Like there's all kinds of ways that this is getting around, and from the proto-internet. So I think all of this is part of a cultural text about how to participate.
Even the selling of the stickers.
Yeah.
Right? Like they have, like within the white nationalist movement, they have their own hats and patches and T-shirts, but the symbolism is so specific because a lot of the symbols don't use words.
Right.
And like, I'm thinking here about Dylan Roof had went out and purchased patches that were Rhodesia patches.
Yeah.
And so there's also just part of like the economy.
Wait, we should explain. Dylan Roof is the Charleston shooter. He was younger than, Rhodesia had not existed during his lifetime. So the Rhodesia patches show that he's part of this earlier movement. He's in this symbol world that existed before him and afterward. With the undergraduates, I get to tell them about when it used to be on mimeographed pages. Everybody remember mimeographed pages? But you can see it go from mimeograph to Xerox to the early internet to the mature internet. But it's the same cultural universe.
So it's citational.
Yeah.
Yes, very much.
But the difference between the mimeograph and now is you can spend all day online in it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
The mimeograph was limited. You could
Yeah, there's just
keep
one and
reading
it smells weird and it's different. Yeah, different thing.
Please.
Your talks. So I've got a question about the kind of economics of the rhizomatic communication system and this participatory media model, and thinking about this sort of no paywalls. So if there are no paywalls, like how does finance connect to these systems? And then coming from that, I actually am really interested in Professor Belew's thoughts on the grid attacks and sort of what's underpinning those. What are these sort of pamphlets, and how do these specific attacks like what is the sort of media ecology that is making these come about?
I mean, the short answer is the economy is funded by sponsors. So it was earlier this year, it came out that Russia had sent $10 million to Lauren Chen, who is a well-known right-wing YouTuber. And then her job was to pull together a network of influencers, including Dave Rubin and Tim Pool. And they were getting paid like $100,000 for an hour-long episode, right? But one of the main engines of finance within the right-wing media sphere is just millionaires and billionaires. Like even a site like Breitbart ran at a deficit because the message is what mattered. It's almost like news is like, the reason why you get so many politics couched in news is people want the news every day. They don't necessarily want politics every day. So you have to create a partisan media system that feels fresh and relevant. And so the way to do that is to give analysis of the news, and people will come back because there's always something new on. You know, and that I think is really important to acknowledge, that news is like the cover or the mask for delivering partisan positions. And that's why I hesitate sometimes to even talk about some of this as journalism, because it is just blanket punditry, right? They're not, and when you look at some of the more prolific influencers that get paid a lot of money on YouTube, they read the news, like they'll go on a website and they'll get, you know, news from the New York Times, and they'll read it and they'll give their take on it. And it's that way of doing the news that is so different from an actual journalistic organization that actually gets the stories. Yep. And so it has this layer of analysis and punditry built into it, but they themselves would never call themselves influencers. They'd say they're journalists. Yeah.
Yeah. I would add that there's also, okay, so the power grid attacks are part of a long strategy in which white power activists have thought that if they can undermine infrastructure, they can provoke race war. So sometimes that's talked about as accelerationism, or sometimes not. But the idea is that if you destabilize comfort for enough white people, they will quote unquote awaken to the ways that they're being persecuted and then join a violent attempt to overthrow the state. So the reason we know that that's part of what's happening is that the pamphlets are calling for attacks on the energy grid exactly along these lines. Those are circulating, I think, just through Telegram channels.
Yeah, for the most part.
I have that from Molly. I don't have it firsthand. So,
no, yeah.
But so they're circulating, and then what we hear from the investigatory, like it'll be a while before we actually know, but we know things. Well, I think a couple of them have been confirmed, but right at the beginning, they're calling the ATF out to investigate, which you don't do if it's an accident. You don't call the ATF out if it's like to strip the copper wire from the thing or whatever. So there's enough kind of smoke that there's something going on, and then we get confirmations as time goes on.
You know, one other thing that I think is important about the media arc that we're talking about from the 80s to today is also the very conscious use of the propaganda technique of creating a media surround that people can stay in for hours and hours and hours of every day. Whether it was talk radio or 24-hour news, or now, you notice a lot of the right-wing podcasters are on for many, many hours a day.
They're on for so long,
And that's an age-old propaganda strategy which imagines that if it's in the background of your life, you're actually being conditioned by it all the time. And so cautionary note for all your feeds and all your podcasts and all your newscast coverage. How much time? We're a little over. We can probably take a couple more. Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. Please, and then maybe Rebecca.
Yes, I like to look for root causes. I viewed an interview with Isabel Wickerson last night.
Sure.
and she was asked about the movement, and a lot of what you were talking about. And she drilled down to the fact that 2042 will be the year that the demographics will shift. Do you think it plays a role in the immediacy of these different groups?
Yes. They talk about that a lot. The idea, so sorry if you can't hear the question, the idea is, does it matter this moment of kind of imagined demographic collapse when, and they've done this since at least the mid-1980s, and they imagine the time when a town or a county or a state or the nation will no longer be majority white. Sometimes they talk about salvageability along those lines, but yes, that's a intense state of emergency for these activists. And they see that, again, not as just sort of like peaceful demographic change or melting pot or diversity or something. They see that as apocalyptic end of their race and people. So it's hard to overstate how huge that is in the imaginary of these
and
groups.
I think there was I forget which newspaper recently did a study of Elon Musk's topics over the last 10 years.
He's worried about that.
And he's very worried about demography and that Western civilization is going to crumble. And so it's not lost on me that he's adopted, this replacement theory rhetoric, which also goes along with Camp of the Saints, at the same time that he buys, a very large communications platform and literally turns it into a psychological weapon.
And an apocalypse bunker in Texas for all 11 families that he has.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting...
This is all part of the same thing.
Yeah, but I think with Musk, his political ambitions are somewhat different than, it's not like he can't be president of the United States, but he really thinks that he's going to buy a position within the Trump orbit, and he's probably going to do a lot of damage before anything is done. But Musk has always been one of these key figures that normalizes this rhetoric around demography is destiny, which is a meme within that movement. And a lot of people listen to him, and he's able to force his opinions into people's feeds relentlessly. Yeah.
Thank you for this. These are wonderful. I wonder if one or both of you could talk about the ideological through lines and evolutions of the misogyny of the white power movement, say the 80s, and the online misogyny that we see today among the TikTok fascists and incels that, manifest, for example, in the cat lady memes.
Mm-hmm. That's one for you.
So the misogyny in these groups is deep and widespread, of course. And the sort of the incel movement is deepening some of that. But, and this is a big thing, I think we, in rooms like this, often underestimate the amount of activism being carried out by women within these movements also. So in the white power movement in the 80s, for instance, women would commonly say, like, I'm not political, I'm nothing but a wife and mother, as they were doing things ranging from writing their own newspapers to driving getaway cars for men in the movement. So, and they're violent, they got involved even in frontline violent activism. They've been in every part of this. However, and this is a huge however, especially as this movement is kind of merging with Christian nationalism and theocratic movements, it is a fundamentally revanchist ideology that wishes women to, it wants to turn back the clock on women's rights in all kinds of different ways. They talk a lot about like the Proverbs woman. They talk about, why women shouldn't need to vote, why the husband is heading the household. Like, it's the whole litany of things that you would expect. So it's been interesting to see on that front sort of this latest round of media coverage of the Kamala Harris ad for women saying like, your vote is your business, no one will know your vote unless you tell them. And I think the They chose the very blonde, blue-eyed white woman in like the bedazzled Trump hat. Has everybody seen this ad? I guess it doesn't say Trump, it says vote or something. But we're meant to know that it's a bedazzled MAGA hat, right? And she goes in and she's like, no one will know, wink, wink, that I voted for Harris. So that ad followed by an immediate media protest from the right, like, this is ridiculous, like, what, they don't need to do this. Then followed by scores of Christian commentators saying, like, if my wife voted for Harris, it would be akin to having an extramarital affair. Like, of course she has to vote the way I do. I'm the head of the house, like, the dad is heading the family, like, and it goes on like that, right? Like, so it's like immediate denial and then immediate blatant embrace. I think that thing is the same sort of like, we're not doing plausible deniability anymore. This is what it stands for, right? So to me, that's another movement in kind of toward the, I guess, the distillation of how extreme some of the end games are. But certainly, like, you can't look at the reproductive policy and not immediately see that this is going in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have more to say on it.
We're going to give Joan the last word.
Oh, no, you don't. No, you don't. Take the power back.
I think we're going to have to give up the room in a moment,
Yeah.
but please stick around if you have a couple of questions you want to ask here. But first of all, thank you all for coming, and please thank Kathleen.